since he's not here.
There you go.
And then Matt will be the resident road and bridge microphone.
Be the
Which is weird.
the second row microphone versus the first row.
You keep sitting behind them like you're going to go this whole meeting saying nothing, but we'll pretend with you. All right, it is 1:00 and we are here for our continued workshop meeting. With that, we will start where we left off.
So since the last meeting, this is Jacob L., Planning Director. Since the last meeting, I created a red line version with all the draft changes to date. Sent that to the board Friday. I'm sure you've had plenty of time to review it by now, right? So if there's anything in that from my notes that's incorrect, please let me know. And then I believe where we ended was we got past hazardous areas, public services, transportation, and we are on to the housing section.
Special areas or sites.
We discussed special area sites, and I had one change there.
Yeah, I believe we just concluded that at the last time. Is that where your notes say as well?
That's what I had. And then on to the housing section. So I'll share my screen here shortly and go from there. So the last format of this was discuss the section as a commission, ask questions of the planning commission, and then open up for public comment on each one of the sections. Looks like we have a couple of folks on our Zoom session. We want to ask them for public comment.
All right.
And just to mention that I did note, I did go through your revisions, and I had just a few items that I wanted to go back through at the end that I think my notes were just a little different than your notes, if we could clarify what our group intent is.
And just a reminder, this is up for hearing tomorrow from the Planning Commission's recommendation. So I think that hearing is scheduled for 1:30 along with the land use component.
Okay. So are we ready for public comment?
I think we're ready for a discussion on this first, and then I think that's what we decided last time was we discuss it, you ask questions, and then public comment on it.
Okay, so I wasn't at the end of your meeting, so I was asking where did we lead off? So I thought you said you left off on public comment.
I think
so where are we?
I think we concluded the special areas or sites section, and we're ready to start on the housing section, was what my notes indicate.
And so when you completed the special area sites, did you have public comment? And I'm asking only because I saw a flash of yellow, then it went down.
I don't believe we had any members of the public at the end of that meeting when we discussed it. Is that right?
That's my recollection as well.
Okay, so we're just going to move into housing then. All right.
I did not have any questions or proposed changes to this section.
You mentioned you had notes from Commissioner Korn as well.
Yes, that'll be the next section.
Okay.
Thank you.
Since you have his notes, when we go through our discussion, can you just say that you have no comment from him? That way he's pulled through this.
That's a good point. Thank you. I have no comment from Commissioner Korn on housing.
Okay. Can I ask the comment on recognizes opportunities should be made for assisted living and group shelters? Is that, what's the reason as a goal? Is that, are we searching that out? Is it that we're supposed to be setting aside? How do we impact that particular goal or objective?
Well, this is Alan Songstad, Planning Commission. I think what we meant there is that the zoning should allow for that type of use.
And then the workforce housing being proximate to agriculture, we're seeing that as a need in outside of agriculture. Oftentimes that is a comment that we see when we're talking about workforce, but they're expanding what workforce housing is in our area. Is it something that we could be more generic on encouraging workforce housing in general, or do you see that identifying where that would be could be limiting, because it could also be just in residential areas considered workforce housing? So, and I'm saying that because it's a conversation I've had with Mayor Grimm about where do you put that type of housing, and in other areas, so I came from Western Washington, you have housing that's not, and the word workforce, I also wanted to know why we're limiting it to that type of housing, like a transitional type of housing, but also like a subsidized type of housing designation, which is can be part of workforce housing, but it's not limited to just that type of area. If you look in where they have housing authorities, sometimes that housing is just in the middle of a residential area. So just my kind of question on, you could reasonably see that outside of those areas and not just to the idea of farmers that are transitional for the season, which is, I think, where that term comes from more, is seasonal type of housing versus.
Well, on item number 5, this is on Soxted again. We say enable workforce housing in direct proximity to agricultural, commercial, recreational, and industrial uses. So we didn't limit it to agriculture. We tried to capture, I think, what you're referring to, which was workforce housing in all those commercial areas and recreational areas.
But what about residential areas? So, and I say, so in some places that housing section is identified as a workforce it's not in a commercial area. It's not in the busy part. That's what I'm just trying to see is that restricting you to saying here versus in the middle of where is residential?
I think, this is Dave Frankenbach, Planning Commission. I think in our mind, and it may not always be the case, but in our mind, workforce housing is multifamily housing. I don't, maybe there will be other instances, but in our minds, when we were thinking about it, at least that was my perception, it's multifamily housing. And when you think about the residential areas in the county, in general, we're talking about suburban is the highest density, and on up to through rural 5 and Ag Forest 10, Ag Forest 20, et cetera. And I think in a lot of those areas, unless it was in direct proximity to one of those uses that we listed here, ag, commercial, rec, or industrial, I don't think we'd want to be putting multifamily housing in the middle of one of those areas, separate and distinct from the particular use that it was there to support.
And that might come through what the definition is, because workforce housing, so I'll use an area that I grew up around, is where the section was considered that, but they were actually individual, very small homes for individual families, but they were incorporated in, it was called Shalishan. And so that was where you saw that housing. And so it wasn't an apartment complex where you would pull that, which I understand what you're saying. It was you could have single family dwellings. And when you look at the smaller footprint kind of cottage idea that our comp plan is pushing, does that mean that is workforce just defined as kind of like a apartment style bunkhouse, or is it something different? And maybe it's a difference of, I came from the city, you guys are using a word that I've heard elsewhere, and it wasn't just apartments.
So I guess the concern this is Dave Frankenbach again, what the concern that would immediately come to my mind if you were talking about basically single-family residences is you get into this whole question then of what kind of sanitary services are available. And, there may be some areas of the county where either they're on public water and sewer systems where maybe that could be done. But outside of those areas, I'd worry about that kind of density on individual wells and septic. So I think you'd have to limit it in that way.
Okay.
And I guess I have a question about whether that would even really be cost effective. If we think about the specific examples that have occurred, I mean, I'm obviously aware of the apartments basically that Schweitzer built in Ponderay. And I think that's a great location for that, because those people, they're then close to the things that are available in town, all of those kinds of amenities, and they can get on a spot bus and go up to the Red Barn and get on a bus up to work, right? So that kind of, for that particular instance, that's a great location for that. A few years ago, when I was on planning and zoning, we had a zone change request on a property that was owned by Hills Resort up Priest Lake. It was like across the street from the resort area, and they wanted to build multifamily housing for their seasonal employees in the summertime. And they had to do a zone change in order to get that property in a zone that allowed multifamily housing. We had another guy come in who I think he's up sort of the north end of the county. He operates a pretty good-sized tree farm, if I remember correctly, and he was saying, hey, I'd really like to be able to have some housing for my employees on my tree farm. So that was an ag use, and it came from a specific guy who came in and talked to us, made some public comments at one of our meetings.
There's a gentleman up at Priest Lake who's also made the comment of, because of that particular resort being able to have a housing option available up there. And so that's the only thing that came to my mind is I'm trying to draw up a picture, but it's it had the opportunity to be single family when I see it, because I've seen those developments occur, and not having created a full-on plan of what does, so here's one of, it's a single family house, but these were spread out in the whole area, and the area is considered workforce transitional low-income housing. That's where my question was, but that's actually, it's in a residential area. It's across from other homes. It's just that area was zoned off. So that was my only comment as we're looking for other housing, which is what I thought the intent of the section is to encourage other types of housing to allow for more. So that was my only comment, was workforce, and we're looking at that. And I guess it comes down to we're defining it as multifamily housing, not single family housing. So,
Go ahead.
Matt Linsky here. And I think it can be. I think it could be both. I think it could be either single family or multifamily, a duplex, a fourplex or something like that. I don't know. I think you were here. I don't think Brian was here yet. Maybe it was 2 summers ago when the gentleman from the Forest Service came, and they had, within their budget, they were able to go ahead and hire X amount of people for a summer cruise. And
Yeah.
they went to all the universities, WSU, U of I, everything, Cheney. And they only had 19 applicants because, and
The housing.
they had the ability already budgeted for, I don't know, I think it was like 100 and some people. It was all boiled down to housing was the problem. People couldn't afford to stay here when they're getting paid, $18 or $19 an hour to work a seasonal summer job. So I think that kind of works in conjunction with that, because, agriculture, that doesn't include timber industry. And that's what they're working on, is those Forest Service trails and systems and stuff. So I think this could go ahead and allow those types of housings in those other zones, in the ag, commercial, rec, industrial use zones, to go ahead and fulfill that need.
when you go to number 3, to encourage through mechanisms such as density bonuses, what does that mean?
Well, I think, as Alan Song said again, if that's in connection with clustered housing, so basically it would be a development where the housing is clustered, but there would be open space that would be available, and you get a density bonus for that kind of
Oh, I
thing.
see what you're saying.
If you guys recall, this is Jacob L., if you recall the planned unit development that came through off right next to the golf course up at Priest Lake, so you had a bunch of open space areas and smaller lots. They actually didn't utilize any bonuses because they didn't want to build that many lots, but that's one of the scenarios where you give up some and you get some.
Yeah.
That's the way the code's written.
Thank you.
So what I'm trying to do is define the term workforce housing, because I think that kind of starts to self-answer the questions everybody asked, that I think are good questions. It's just, as I've been trying to look at statute, of course, the legislature created a specific fund for it for a set period of time, for a 5-year period essentially, that sunsets next year, but they didn't find the term. They just used the term without defining it, so it doesn't help. But from what I understand and what I'm seeing, looking online, there's many forms of workforce housing. You got single family, multifamily. Ultimately, I think it is, what I'm hearing people talk about is it's a term used to define a financial group, right? So we have low-income housing, and then we have what some people will call somewhere from standard to luxury housing. And there's a group between low income and something that's considered some form of luxury or excessive level of housing that they fall within certain percentages of the median income, a little less than or a little more than median. So there's different values I see depending on who defines it, what agency, but somewhere in that like 80 to 120% of median range looks like roughly. And so it kind of gets into the overall concept of affordable housing, but there's more than one type of affordable housing, I think is the challenge that we have. So I'm trying to figure out how we apply that to the intent. And to me, there's housing throughout the county that we know we have an affordability issue, but then this to me is specific to trying to deal with certain types of businesses where proximity to the business location can reduce other impacts on infrastructure and just allow for something that's more efficient. Does that seem consistent with what the Planning Commission's intent was for the focus area?
Yeah, this is Dave Frankenbach again, and yes, I would say that was what we were focused on. And a couple other comments that came to mind as you were speaking. One is we studiously tried to stay away from the whole concept of affordable housing, because I don't think we're in that business of providing. The other comment I was going to make is you also see that we tried to stay away from saying we're going to provide this or provide that. And I'm not even sure as I look at this that I'm crazy about the word encourage. I think in the end, you see our thoughts, I think, most accurately reflected in the way we stated the goal, because we don't think the county is providing housing in any way, shape, or form. What the county is doing is setting up a regulatory environment that either allows things or doesn't allow things. And so we did carefully craft those words in the goal to say that we're providing that, exactly that, a regulatory environment that enables different opportunities for a diverse set of housing solutions and housing needs.
With that, do you think we have to mention that? Because I'm coming from a experience of what does workforce training mean, and when you look at different areas where that's more widely done, for example, Woodburn, Oregon is a good example also. They have workforce training or workforce housing. It's proximate to agriculture. It is intended for multi-use, but their focus is more government involvement in terms of saying that there's a low-income aspect to it, not just, what I think you guys are trying to do is say, these businesses need employees that are going to be seasonal, and we need to make sure that we allow for that use, but arguably it exists inherent in the code by way of the way in which we allow for zoning. So do we need to single out workforce housing when workforce housing has a federal tone to it, because there's federal funding that comes with some of that type of housing? And I'm trying to look up.
Well, this is Alan Soxton again. We did provide here for a variety of housing options around the county, but with respect to workforce housing, I think what we had in mind was the agricultural use that Dave mentioned, and we also had in mind some of the recreational uses, because our tourist uses, because we have a large tourism industry, obviously, in this county, and one of the big problems they have is where do they put the workers, especially the seasonal workers. So I think we were trying to look at the workforce housing. That's why we said in close proximity to these different uses, because that's a cost factor if you're not close. Most of these will probably be within walking distance of where they're actually going to be working. So we wanted to say something about providing workforce housing, not providing it, but enabling, from a regulatory standpoint, workforce housing to be in close proximity to these uses, so these businesses can operate, because that's a real problem in many areas. And it's certainly a problem in the area that I'm most familiar with, which is Priest Lake. I mean, It's a very expensive area, and if you don't provide for some ability to have housing for seasonal workers, there's going to be a problem with operating those businesses.
I agree.
Do you think that the code itself allowing for it is sufficient versus a standout? And so when I looked up Woodburn's workforce housing, and that's how they call it, it's workforce and multifamily housing services. It's to improve communities historically oppressed by housing and labor industries through culturally specific workforce development and community-centered affordable housing management services. And it's the term that, though it's the workforce term, is very specific to, so it's not unique to what you're saying. It is a broader term that's used in a different way. And I think we're speaking the same language, is then you have to define what does workforce housing mean, because this is a concerted effort in the city areas, which it has grown a lot more. And I've actually been to this place. It's a very large one. It is agricultural specific. And this one actually does focus a lot on culture, but it's considered its own thing, workforce. So I just don't like the word.
I agree. I think the intent, with the way our current code language reads, it has temporary and seasonal labor housing. I'm wondering if we want to pull that type of language in instead, only because I think the intent makes perfect sense. I am concerned that workforce is a term that's very politically charged and motivated and has meanings we may not intend, but it may be interpreted that way by folks because of the fact that it is being used in urban renewal and other settings, and I think it's going to potentially get confused with the setting that we're intending it for.
So you could take out workforce and just say enable housing for workers in close proximity. I mean, you could take out workforce if that's the problem.
Even labor housing, I think, it's just, the term is different enough from the one that's being used to drive policy and economic decisions at other levels that we're not trying to engage in.
Even NIC has workforce training centers.
Yeah, I think temporary and seasonal would be another good description of what we were thinking about.
I think I like instead of saying it, I like the temporary and seasonal as well, because it accomplishes the need to draw attention to the work aspect and the proximity of what you're talking about, but not focus on all the other stuff that exists. I think that would solve it to me.
We had this discussion, and in the end, this maybe decided that when you get into the issue of affordable housing and so on, I think our view was the best area for that. There's no doubt that issue exists in the county, but our belief was the best area for that to be addressed is within the cities, because that's where it's most cost effective. They have the services. And then housing is in close proximity to the other amenities that people are going to need. A lot of them would be in walking distance. You know, if it's truly low income, they may not have a lot of transportation, so being able to walk around or use a spot bus or what have you. So we felt like that was a better location to address that issue in the county, not out in the rural areas of the county.
I agree from an infrastructure and impact perspective, and we want government to have the lightest touch possible on free market decisions, and if we try to control that, that's a dangerous place to go. So I agree with that perspective.
Especially the impact on infrastructure in those areas,
And that's where, going back to policy one, I think Dave, you mentioned, or someone did, do we want to change the word encourage to enable there? Because we want to have.
This is Dave again. My personal opinion is enable is better. Enable's a better statement of what our intent was.
I agree.
We're not really trying to encourage people to do one thing or the other. Like you said, we want to let the market make those decisions, but we want to allow for those things to happen in the right areas.
We do have a hand up if you want to go to public comment.
Are we done discussing it as the board?
I am, if you are.
And then Commissioner Korn has no comments on his write-up?
Commissioner Korn has no comments
All
on
right.
this one, other than he had a question mark next to this item that we're talking about. So
Okay,
there was a question and we've answered it.
All right. Do you want to state what his question was?
No, literally, there was just a question mark.
Oh,
But he pointed out that he had specific comments on 2 items, and that was
Okay.
not one of them, so
Okay.
I think we're good.
all right, Mr. Bowman.
Okay, Dave Bowman here. So I was putting my hand up and down about 3 times because I wanted to say something and then what I wanted to say got said anyway. I completely agree with the temporary and seasonal aspect. What Commissioner Frankenbach said was also what I don't know, meaningful. It was good in that taking the Schweitzer housing that's in Ponderay and those apartment buildings as an example where they are close to amenity, but in an area that where they could take the spot best to the Red Barn and so on up to their job, would it be instead of saying in direct, because, and I spent a lot of time in Alaska where workforce housing was a bunkhouse, right? So it really does, and when you all were discussing the various meanings that the term workforce can take on is to me another indication that it would be highly appropriate to have a glossary of terms put into this implementation component at some point. But what I was coming to, instead of saying in direct proximity, what if that was replaced with, say, in areas that are appropriate to serve the workforce or the workers or the labor force in those areas? Because it's just like what Commissioner Frankenbach said about the Schweitzer housing, that's not in direct proximity to the mountain, but it's couldn't ask for a better location to do what they're doing. And, you know, if somebody's running a sawmill out in the middle of nowhere, well, you may not want high density housing in there, but maybe it's appropriate. So I think it has to kind of be looked at case by case because you're covering all these different, you know, ag, commercial, recreational, industrial, and so on. So I don't, it's hard to make a cookie cutter solution that fits all of them.
So if I could make a friendly amendment, this is Dave again, to Dave's suggestion for number 5, we could do both. We could say enable temporary and seasonal housing in direct proximity to those uses or in other areas. What were the words you used, Dave? In other areas?
Where that are appropriate to serve those workers or labor.
Yeah.
Those,
Something like that.
Stumbled up there. That's,
I like leaving the direct proximity clause in because I think we're going to see a lot of that particular application, probably not in the Schweitzer case because it's too expensive to build housing up on the mountain. But in most of these other uses, if you think about ag, the idea is if you got a big ag operation, put it right there, and that may very well be just a bunkhouse. If you think about the example that Matt talked about, where the Forest Service wanted a bunch of seasonal workers to come in for the summer, that may be a bunkhouse as well also. And somewhere out where the National Forest, where they want to have workers build trails or whatever it is that they want to do for the summer.
Yeah. What if we?
But
said-
there are other areas. I agree
Yeah.
with what Dave is suggesting, that that's not the only example, and Schweitzer is the perfect
I think it is a good
example of
point
that.
that you guys have raised. I'm wondering if we use language like, you know, or where services and infrastructure can support such uses, something like that, because that's what we're trying to say, right? It's a low impact because we already have the infrastructure in place to allow that to occur. Is that?
I think
I'd agree with that.
the more words we put in on that end, then you'll end up with the how do you weigh, you know, like if where appropriate services are, if you're talking about like transportation or outside of development and the infrastructure of your water and your sewer, what are the key metrics that you're saying when you add that last part of that sentence in
Probably
there?
gonna be transportation, but that's where I think the use tables will
Yep.
ultimately provide the notes that say what it
And I
needs to
think
be.
that is where you're going, is with transportation, but Bonner County does not have transportation. It's, the spot bus is not within our control of routes and whatnot. So when we're talking about being considerate, when we were changing out the word, we were very specific in a different section of, we don't have a bus, we're talking about roads and networks. So I don't want to say that the county is dependent on the service of Spot Bus, as the county equally says, well, we don't contribute to Spot Bus, that's out of our control.
Oh, I
So
agree.
how do we define the latter portion? Because I agree with what you're saying, but if a person who's reading it, I want to know what is the metric I have to hit, because if it gets denied and there's a comment of, well, we don't feel that that's enough service for transportation for that increased density that would exist with that type of housing, what am I using to say that? And I know you're going to say, well, that's where you're going to see it in the code, but that description in here seems it's a little bit open to interpretation if it's where available, if we don't identify what's needed to be there for that to exist. Does that make sense? Because we're not telling them, we're in this sentence, you're saying that that must be proximate to that type. And it's reasonable to say, but that might not necessarily be enough to say you can have it there for other reasons. But do you even have to keep going down there, because all of the sentence is telling us is we need to enable it, but that doesn't mean it's a guarantee. But when you start saying when these things are there in this section, are you being a little bit too specific and adding things that are not in our control?
So this is Dave again. I think you got me thinking in a different direction now. I'm not sure that I could think of many examples like the Schweitzer case that would happen in the unincorporated county. I think most of the examples like the Schweitzer case are going to be in one of the cities, and then therefore it's out of our jurisdiction. So given that, perhaps what we've said here is enough, because what we've said here is obviously it's limited to just the unincorporated areas of the county. And maybe then in the unincorporated areas of the county, the only thing we're talking about is enabling it in direct proximity to those uses that may have a need for temporary and seasonal housing. And something like what Schweitzer's doing, where they want to go into Pend Oreille, that's like I said, that's out of our jurisdiction.
All right, Lance.
Hi, Lance Badger with Schweitzer Mountain Properties. We were the developers of the Pend Oreille project, and there was a lot of thought that went into that. And it's very clear with the mix of employees on the mountain that the majority of them that are here for the long term, in terms of living here year round, certainly wanted to live in closer to the city, or closer to the services and school systems and transportation. It's a pretty lonely place living up on the mountain full time for someone who's a young worker up there. There's not a lot of things to do up there after work. If you want to go out with your friends and you need to go to the grocery store or go to the post office. So there are certain needs on the mountain where it makes sense for certain employees' positions, but the majority would rather be in places like Pend Oreille or Sandpoint, closer to services and conveniences. So I just want to point that out, but also recognize that there will be at some point a need for maybe some additional housing up on the mountain, more in the style of a dormitory, as Dave was referring to, a bunkhouse situation where maybe you're there 3 days during the week instead of full time, something like that. Anyway, I appreciate it. This is a good topic. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Bowman, sorry. You were
Yeah,
slow.
don't apologize. Hey, I just wanted to say, what if at the end of this clause, it's it's inserted to say where service and infrastructure can support the use.
Do you need that in that clause, since that's a requirement of isn't that inherent in the plan already? That's part of an approval?
It is. I guess I would just say belt and suspenders sometimes doesn't hurt.
I think it's fine to add that.
I agree.
I don't think it hurts. I'm just saying, do you need the extra words on the document? So I can be fine on it.
I think it helps again when whoever's working on it, when the time comes, is crafting the requirements, the notes that go with the use table think it's helpful guidance.
So when it says where services are available, what services need to be available?
Well, what I said was not, I didn't say that. I said where services and infrastructure can support the use.
Okay, what,
I say that partly because this whole discussion has circled around how to clarify what this clause means or how it could be maybe misdirected or whatever. And from my perspective, adding that little clause at the end just helps kind of pin it down and leave it to where it's it can be used where it's appropriate, but kind of take out the wiggle room that somebody might want to put in there. That's all.
so can you hang on there though, because you said services and infrastructure, and so my question though is, the infrastructure, we know what we're calling infrastructure, that exists in the plan. What services are we saying meets that definition under this section? What services are we identifying? And that word still comes with, in my opinion, the same concern of we're not in control of some of the things that we'd like to see, and that is something that, do we need to define it, or is that in the overall plan of this area? Because what is a service that I need to consider when looking at this type of housing outside of infrastructure? What's the service that we're talking about?
That's a fair comment. I really I'm so used to putting service and infrastructure together that it just kind of comes out of habit for me. So maybe I was a little bit on autopilot. So maybe it would be, maybe services doesn't need to be there with infrastructure. Good. I mean, that's a good catch.
So I've got to go to Matt, who was up before Dave, and then Lance, and then Commissioner Donkey.
Matt Linska here. As I'm looking at that where it says temporary and seasonal, and Lance can probably weigh in on this from Schweitzer. They have summer crews, and they have crews, getting prepping things up for the winter, winding things down in the winter time, but then they have summer crews as well. So I don't know if we want to limit that to temporary and seasonal housing.
Isn't that, it's not permanent, so doesn't temporary meet that?
Well, maybe Lance can weigh in on that. I don't know.
Lance?
Yeah, I think you may be overthinking a little bit. There are definitely part-time employees, there's seasonal employees, there's full-time, and then there's seasonal full-time as well. And so they all have different needs and wants as it relates to housing. I think from a operational standpoint, those who are here long-term that have families or larger groups, the housing in Ponderay serves very well. And those usually are people that are more mature, a little older, having families, maybe have a spouse and kids, et cetera. We also have a dormitory type facility. It's an old care facility in town that Schweitzer purchased. I think it has 8 rooms where they have dual bunks in those rooms, and those really handle some seasonal workers in the winter, and then seasonal workers in the summer. But I think you'll see the same thing on the mountain, but you probably won't see long-term workforce housing on the mountain. You'll see more seasonal and part-time. Does that help?
Actually, let me clear. You said seasonal and part-time as in living in this type of structure? Because temporary, you can be part-time permanent, and that's your schedule. Because if we said temporary and seasonal, there's a reason to believe that as a temporary person, you'll no longer be there, but a part-time person could be a permanent part-time employee. And this section would exclude something like that, because you're saying basically those who are living in this type of housing would be in a transition in and out, not a permanent part-time person.
And I think we intentionally should exclude that because we want it to be temporary or seasonal. Otherwise, we're getting into the economic aspect of housing, which is what we don't want to try to control, because then we're getting back into the workforce thing that we can't properly define, is my concern.
I don't disagree. I just wanted to clarify, since you said part-time and the word is up there is temporary.
I think well, this is Alan Songstad. I think you're not talking about temporary and seasonal housing. I think you're talking about housing for temporary and seasonal workers.
Correct.
So we need to change that around.
Well, it could be temporary and seasonal labor housing. That's what we say
Okay.
in the code, I believe.
Yep, farm
That's not
labor
temporary housing.
I say, the way it's written there, it's
right.
not specific to the workers, so you're just, so long as I'm in direct proximity to one of these, you can make a use, you can take like a tiny home village or an RV park and an ag forest 20 and say this supports that change in the code, so long as it's in direct proximity to that use.
I agree
So
with
if you want to specify
Labor
for
housing.
labor housing, I think we need to add that qualifier in there.
Good point.
So temporary and seasonal labor housing?
Or, yeah, employee labor.
'Cause I agree, otherwise what we're saying is the housing itself is temporary or seasonal versus.
Yep, so let's say
Well, if you build it out of sticks and mud in North Idaho, it will be temporary and seasonal.
We're talking about a tent.
Yeah, there you go. Well,
That's
yours.
not temporary in Idaho. I don't know how in Europe.
see some
over
nice
by
yurts.
Voodoo.
canvas walled tents, yep, people live in them. Around.
Any further public comment on the housing section?
So I know there was a bunch of discussion about adding something at the end of this. I'm not sure if there's a general agreement.
I think we decided it was not necessary.
Okay.
Well, no. I think Mr. Bowman conceded the word service, but infrastructure was there.
Exactly.
You're right, we did come to that conclusion.
So not where infrastructure supports,
I think it's or where infrastructure
Yeah.
supports.
Such uses. Those uses, yeah.
I had said where it's adequate to support, but that may not be necessary, the way you worded it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that comes under supports, and I would also, I would still be okay with having the word services if we define it, because we use services a lot in the comp plan, because it has to do with things like utilities, emergency services. Those are what we consider to be services. But we can leave it out, or we can use the term and define it.
Well, that's part of infrastructure, like your utilities are infrastructure. And so I think that services, the infrastructure captures what this type of housing is. Services, if you can define a service that you would require to be available, when we were talking, the comments was made about transportation and spot bus, and my comment was, that's not within our control, that is a service, but it is not our service to be in control of, so.
Right, the kinds of services the county addresses are things like fire protection, law enforcement, EMS. Those are the services that we consider within land use, not a public transportation system.
So are you wanting to argue to put services in that section, or?
I am, because of what I'm thinking about is, we just had the discussion that came up about RV parks in certain areas where there's an issue with fire protection and other emergency services, and I'm thinking it still makes sense and can be applicable, because you are looking at creating essentially what is a high-density housing condition, potentially in an area that's more difficult to access. And so I think it's a worthy consideration,
So
if we define the term.
when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about the roads and all that which is in the power of the county. We also are looking at the infrastructure that is law enforcement and EMS, and Panhandle Health, which is why we're sending that letter for what's the impact. So when we're talking about services outside of the way in which we're addressing the land use, which is already inherent in the way this example, what is the service that we would say has to be available there? That's the thing that I'm not seeing.
That's what I was just
is-
describing. So in my understanding, typically infrastructure is historically understood to be the built environment. So your roads, you can have, water and sewer and other utility systems. That's infrastructure. Services are what are provided that come to you and do something that's not the built environment. So that would be fire protection, law enforcement, EMS, that would be services.
So I just don't, I think that's critical infrastructure. I see that as a critical part of infrastructure piece.
I don't think you'll find that in the definition of infrastructure anywhere.
Because then how do you argue for areas that have no, so your unincorporated areas don't have, we have contracts with areas and we say you're not covered. I mean, when you're in
Right.
Southwest Bonner County, there's no coverage.
It's a contract for a service, though. It's not infrastructure.
Okay, I'm going to disagree, and I'll hold to, I don't think service, I don't see it as something that I could identify there. Back to you, Dave.
I'm just going to say that I initially had conceded to you, Commissioner Williams, but after hearing Commissioner Domke, and with all due respect, Commissioner Domke is absolutely correct. Fire service, law enforcement, all those, they are services and they're dealt that way, called throughout the planning environment. And I think I'm going to have to go, for whatever it's worth. I agree with Commissioner Domke. They should be included, because in the RV park in Blanchard is a perfect example where even though those things are available county-wide, they serve the entire county. Well, with exception of a few very isolated areas, they are not necessarily there in the time and the quantity and the effectiveness needed to support a particular density or use. So, and if they are, well, then if the term services is put in there with infrastructure, and it turns out that they are, there's no harm in having it in there, and it further clarifies. So that's all. Thank you.
I think we need to define the term is the issue in my mind. If we define the terms services and infrastructure, then I think we're capturing all of the necessary items.
Okay.
Is that a reasonable, in your mind, approach if we define it?
Well, I think if you put it in there, I think you have to define it. I'm going to go back on what is your level of service then that we're asking? I don't see it as any different. We're asking your EMS and your fire to review what our increase in density aspect is. So if you define what you want as a service, then, and it's clear, then that needs to exist. I don't think you can just say the word. I see those things as a part of critical infrastructure. Yes, it does provide a service, but that's the reason that we actually reach out, because they're part of the infrastructure. There's a statutory requirement with respect to law enforcement and how we engage. So I'm fine with it if you define it, and then.
I think we need to define it by the sheer fact that you and I interpret the terms differently. So I think that's a good reason why it should be defined.
It should be consistent with how we treat it throughout the whole document, not just this particular section of what's required.
Are you talking about primarily public safety services? You could say that. Fire and police.
Emergency services.
I think we use the term emergency services elsewhere, haven't we?
I don't know if in this specific component, but I know in other components. we
Elsewhere
have,
in the
yeah.
component.
Just so long as it's consistent with.
Yeah,
where you're
that
going
would
to
be
put
best. I
something.
agree to have it be consistent.
So if you were to use the consistent terms, it would be emergency services and sanitary service infrastructure, right?
Yep.
That's what we're talking about is water, sewer infrastructure and emergency services. That's-
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Brian that infrastructure is things that are built, and ordinarily I would put water and sewer into that category.
Roads.
I'm afraid that if we carefully review everything we've done, we may find places where we've referred to water and sewer as services.
We do use the term emergency services under the public services, facilities, and utilities section, so that would create consistency, to your point.
Okay.
And yeah, this is Dave again, and there we were specifically referring to fire, law enforcement, and EMS.
But the way this sentence reads now, it's or we're emergency services and infrastructure. So is that the emergency infrastructure or what type of infrastructure? Or do we want to define that further?
I think,
Reverse it. or infrastructure and emergency services.
That's a good point.
Yeah, that does correct the.
Okay. So do
We
we
could
send it-
reword the, no, just kidding.
Anything further on that section? Housing? Matt, this is your section. Okay. Your team said no.
Like
so
next to the
sorry.
water.
I tried. Community design.
I have a comment from Commissioner Korn on this item, and I share his comment. Under policy 1, in the middle of that paragraph includes accounting for wildlife corridors, and I think we should strike that. As we discussed at, I don't remember, it was the last or 2 workshops ago, in North Idaho, we don't have a definitive map to follow to identify individual wildlife corridors. We live in a giant wildlife corridor of many types, and so without that high level of definition, I think it's too broad of a term to use, so I think we should just remove it.
This might sound low level, but I just didn't like the word to enable a variety of lifestyles. I felt like this section is about the design, so why not just say a variety of designs? Lifestyle sounds like an individual.
Oh, you're under goals and objectives?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
at the top of it. Lifestyles is to the person, not to the design, in theory, but also some lifestyles create a community design that, I'll just put it out there, the whole rainbow sidewalk design,
Can we say uses instead of lifestyles?
or just, you'd say how you want to. I just don't want to deal with rainbow sidewalk issue questions. And when I hear lifestyle, when I read it, and you look at the debate that's currently happening of, is that is a community design?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying we'd
No,
have to?
this is Dave Frankenbach. I don't remember the discussion when we came up with that word, but I don't like the word either. I think what we were really thinking is think about what we have in the unincorporated areas of the county. We have everything from suburban areas where with the right services, you could be on a 10 or 12,000 pretty typically suburban kind of lot, all the way up to people who are living on 100 acres and, have a ranch. And so that's the spectrum
Okay.
of whatever word you want to use. I'm not sure what the right word is. I don't think design works either in that case, but that's the
Yeah.
spectrum that we were trying to
Housing
describe.
types?
But it's not really just housing.
And that's where I've seen this argument playing out in areas like that, and that's my example of where the community, there are pitting arguments over that, and I don't think that was the intent, so I just wanted to draw attention to, I just didn't like that word choice.
I think we have a public comment.
Dave, will this be final answer,
moment
or
ago.
are you going to renegotiate your answer after?
Yeah, I want to go back to the housing for a minute.
We are on community design.
Yeah, I know. I agree with Commissioner Domke here. If you have to put a word in there, put uses. It covers the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if I was too broad with the term though, because we're trying to be specific to, well,
Why can't you just have a design that maintains the rural character and future development of Bonner County, and that is it? Why do you have to identify how you do that?
The reason I don't like design is because particularly in the planning context, there are some communities that actually have design standards. They tell you, how your house has to be designed. And I don't think that's at all what we mean here.
yeah, maybe just uses
So-
does work.
Yeah, I think, the more I think about it, of the suggestions that have been put on the table so far, I think uses is the best one I've heard so far. That's my personal opinion, but.
No comment? Okay. I just didn't want lifestyle, so I'm gonna be.
I agree with you on that. I agree that that's,
Yeah, well, we definitely weren't thinking about lifestyle in the sense that you were, Commissioner
I
Williams.
was, you watched.
We
the
were
news
thinking
and added one
more
where
about,
It's been an argument.
the different types of goings on in the county and stuff. Uses probably encapsulates what we were looking for. Community design was an interesting component because the previous comp plan didn't even have that component, which I thought made the comp plan defective. So we kind of created this out of thin air.
so to speak.
If you don't like the word
it's
design, are
good.
you not liking it in the word after community? Or it was just in that, putting it in that goal?
It's hard to say. I don't know. Matt may have some context on this. If the intention of the legislature, when they said this should be a component that you include, was to open the door for communities that want to have design standards, I don't have a problem with that. In the right kind of community, that makes sense. Doesn't make sense at all in Bonner County. So if that was their intent, to open up the door to say, here's where you would document that if you want to have design standards, then I would argue we should say this is not applicable to Bonner County. If they meant something else, then, it's there, and we're told this component has to be there, and it has to be called community design.
Oh, it says it has to be called community design?
Yeah, the component, the names of whatever there are, 13 components are defined by the legislature.
I just don't want to get into arguing with community members on, I want this versus that kind of deal, but I think we're good, though. So if we change the word lifestyles to allow uses, which is what the intent was, and then we address the wildlife issue, I think that addresses it. Any further comment, Commissioner?
I'm
He's downloading right now.
looking at statute to try to understand their intent.
So the way statute reads, and this is for the component, right? And comes out of 6508M under community design. An analysis of needs of governing landscape building design, tree planting signs and suggested patterns and standards for community design development and beautification. So it really is kind of a subjective, how do you want your community to look?
Yeah.
Does it have to be, it didn't say it had to be called that, so you could look
Well,
at it.
It's under the community design name. So each one of these components, as we have them listed out, is
Oh,
community design, housing, agriculture. Yeah.
So when we looked at this is Alan Sogstead again, when we looked at this, we thought that most of what was in that description in 6508 didn't apply to Bonner County. So we kind of focused on the rural character and kind of focused the component as well as this part of the implementation component on just kind of that subject.
Yeah, I agree with your interpretation. I think to interpret it otherwise, without seeing language that starts to get into, covenants and restrictions and some sort of legal agreement, without seeing that kind of language, which I don't know why we would interpret it that way. So I agree with the direction you guys went in.
any further public comment on community design? All right, did you get your track changes?
So what I gathered was changing lifestyles to uses and then removing wildlife corridors. Was there anything else?
Nope. All right, agriculture.
The only change I have here is it goes on policies 4 to 5 back to 4. So I will change that to 6.
Can I ask on goal number 1, retaining large and small scale commercial agriculture and hobby farms as viable uses? Does it have to be, when you say, hobby farm is not, I guess I want to make sure that it's not just like a big commercial type of area, because the goal is to encourage larger tracts of land where we can. I guess maybe that's in the hobby farm section.
I think
Is that what
hobby
hobby farm is?
farms would be considered a smaller scale use as compared to a larger commercial type. I think adding the term homesteading might also be appropriate because that's a recognizable small-scale agricultural use.
Yeah, this is Dave Frankenbach. I wouldn't object to adding homesteading. I think the key distinction between a hobby farms and the other two is that it's not, it's certainly not the sole source of income, may not even be a source of income at all. It may just be something that people do because they enjoy doing it.
It's typically an expense.
Yeah.
I agree, it's not a commercial income-based enterprise commonly.
I just wanted to make sure that we were not discouraging people that were doing the self-sufficient on larger scales or smaller scales, that's non-commercial, but that is what they exist on. Because there are people I'm Southwest Bonner County, where they have large tracts of land and they grow their own stuff. And so it's not a commercial activity. And so when the sentence read, I just wasn't sure, does that mean that large and small are only for commercial, but what is hobby? Because when we hear hobby, the way in which listening to some planning files, it's 5 acres or less, not a larger.
Yeah, I think if we go back to the kind of sentence structure that Alan did earlier, if we were to say by retaining homesteads, comma, hobby farms, comma, and our hobby farm has got, on a large and small scale commercial agriculture, then I think we would build the dichotomy of, we have these personal, non-commercial type uses that are smaller typically, but not always in nature. And then we have these more commercial uses that are agricultural related.
Matt Linscott here. I have a question for you guys who reference homestead, because, we have the Homestead Act, and then we have what was referred to as the homestead tax exemption, which we now call the homeowners, but still I see it written homestead exemption. So I don't know.
That might create confusion.
It could. I don't know if there's a different name we can use.
Good question.
As far as a commercial, we could probably just take commercial out of there.
I would like to take commercial out so that it's open up to the individual, but I actually agree with you also on the comment on homestead, because somebody actually reached out to the board over if you're some rule in the country about if you're doing a homestead, and you got to wade through a lot of litigation on it, but it was if it's worth a certain dollar amount, do you not have to pay property tax question? I don't see that word used throughout our code, our comp plan enough to say that would be one that we wouldn't have to have a legal review of putting it in there. But I think if you took out the word commercial, it would address the homestead aspect of it. And then my other comment on the goal is, should it say by retaining and encouraging or enabling? Something more than just keeping what's there.
Which one are you on?
On the same one, Bonner County by retaining, the word retaining is used. And I wasn't, on some of it, on some places in our comp plan, we say encouraging. And I say that because some people might, on other sections, we've tried to incentivize people to keep the larger tracts of land. If we've gone through years where Bonner County has we've not encouraged it necessarily. So that was my only comment, is should the word retain and encourage? Because that's part of it. It's not just what they're doing on it, but it is large tracts of land.
So this is Dave Frankenbach. I would encourage you to use enable rather than encourage. Because encourage, what would the county actually do
Right, and so
proactively
that's
to
where-
encourage?
Yeah.
And in line with the one before, the word enable was used.
Yeah, I think enable is a better, and particularly in the land use regulation context, enable is a better word for what we're going to actually be doing.
It's the legislature's job to decide about tax incentives and things of that nature.
It's of interesting note, because if you actually look at the agriculture component that we already completed, I think Dave drafted that, if I'm not mistaken. It's very interesting. Only 2 or 3% of all farms in Bonner County produce a median household income at the median level, which is $53,000, $55,000 or something like that. 97% of all farms out there are hobby farms. They're not the primary source of income.
I think it's, so being in a section where I think when I hear hobby, it doesn't sound like what it means to some of the people that do this. Some of it is, I don't need to buy my food because I grew it. I'm just not selling it, earning an income. But if you calculate what I don't have to spend, I can exist on what my activity is. And I think that's why the word homestead is a valuable word because it's recognizing that before we went into working for other people, we grew our own food and then we exchanged that to go to work. There are people that grow their own food and they barter some hay for the item that they're not using. And so because we can't say that they're collecting a living wage off of it, doesn't mean it's a hobby like me knitting a blanket that I don't need to knit.
I agree with that context.
Yeah, and I think-
Hobby is almost too small.
It feels a little
Yeah.
bit, I feel it's a dismissive type of terminology when it's not. A lot of people in some areas of this county are wanting to go back to the self-sufficient aspect of farming, and it's not a hobby. It is replacing a good part of what people say they can't afford to buy in Bonner County.
I think if we just remove and hobby farms, because commercial's been removed, large and small scale agriculture captures everything.
Matt here, and I wouldn't disagree with you, other than the fact that out of the 5 sub-areas, I know for a fact at least 3 of them use the term hobby farms.
They do, but
Yeah.
yeah, I agree that there could be, it's not defined.
I think there's a good number of people that, one thing, when COVID happened, we were prepared and it was like, I get to show that I don't need to go out and buy anything. I don't need to rush for anything. And that wasn't a hobby, that was preparing. And I think that's a lot of our county. I still think retaining and enabling, get rid of commercial, get rid of hobby farm, and it addresses what I
Yeah.
feel like reflects, because I think that's reflecting what our community wants to see us see the farming as valuable. Mr. Bowman?
Dave Bowman here. I agree. I see that retaining is still crossed out, and I wanted to ask that I would agree that it should be in there. Another word that might suffice in there is preservation, by, enabling and preserving, but the concept is there either way, I think, but retention and or preservation is super important.
I actually like, for the spirit of that particular goal, I actually like the word preservation more than the word retaining. It sounds historical, I don't know. It sounds very in line with what the sentence
Sophisticated is the word you're looking. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm not willing to go there because you took back your support like 2 questions ago, so we'll see if we get back there. No, I do think it's not just sophisticated, I think it's at the core of what that sentence is trying to portray, is that we cannot encourage it, but preserving it is what we're trying to do, and we're trying to make sure we enable that use. And so I think that captures,
You're saying preserving and enabling.
yeah. Preserve what's there.
Just because Jake already got rid of it, that's a,
I think that captures the spirit of Bonner County too.
I would agree with that.
Anything further in terms of
Commissioners?
comment? Did Commissioner Korn have anything on agriculture?
He does, under goals and objectives, number 2. And this goes back to definitions, I would agree. Discourage fragmentation of large agricultural lands. We don't know how to define large. So either we can define it in the context of the sentence, as we've done in some other places, with the word adequate, I think it was, that we defined in context of the sentence, or we can use a different term and define it in our definitions section we still need to create.
Now all together, just say discourage fragmentation of agricultural lands.
That's true.
Because I think that's what the first one actually accomplishes.
Yeah, what we were addressing in this component, or this section of the implementation component, is the many, many comments we received over the last 3 years about retaining agricultural lands,
Yeah.
trying to discourage any fragmentation of those lands. So that's the concept that we're trying to get into this. So
Gotcha.
we may have been focused on large lands, we thought it was 20 acres.
Yeah.
But I think taking it out is fine.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's helpful. And I know this is comp plan, not zoning, but that's one of the things right now we trip over with AF10 versus AF20. One of the things is something to do with the capability to have productive large agricultural tracts of land, and it's like that's a really amorphous thing to try to define.
Well, we're struggling with that right now because we're back in the zoning code,
Yeah.
and we're dealing with the descriptions of Ag 10 and Ag 20. So
Yeah.
that's where it's going to be, and we're trying to create some good definitions for that.
Great, yeah, because I know we trip over that one right now in some of our hearings. It's a challenge.
On policies, there is a question that comes up of housing on the land identified as the agriculture. When you're looking at the future of the comp plan, does that allow for that flexibility? There's different competing thoughts. When you're talking about the land that's being used for agriculture, there's a group that say there should be a house allowed on that for the farmhands and whatnot. There's a group that says, nope, that the point of it is to keep it specifically for large-scale agricultural pursuits. That is going to continue to be an argument in our state until we, especially as we're looking at those agricultural protection zones. But because of that, there's that question of, do you allow housing on those as well? There's an argument for affordable housing, but then it's, how do you are you continuing to use your ag land and you're breaking it up for housing? So, Matt,
In the APA, this legislature did just correct that or update that through amending the APA.
right, and it's still up for continued review because it's not exactly where they want it to be. So, so I sit on one of these groups where they're talking about, they're basically baby stepping this idea forward, that's one of the points of, that people are still not fully satisfied with where they landed.
Matt Linsky here. If you look at the agriculture exemption clause in statute, I can't remember if that's 60, 63 or 64, Title 63. Anyway, it says you have to have at least 5 acres, including home site.
Yeah.
So right there, I mean, you can look at state statute to see what it says. And it's, it says 5 acres, including home site, so.
And I agree that, I think it comes back to a density question because at the end of the day, I think agriculture without a residence to be the farmer is not a common sense approach. It's one thing if you're talking the Midwest and you're going to or even the middle of our state, if you're going to go out there and have combines and farm thousands of acres at a time, that's one thing, but that's not the geography of Bonner County. So I do think we have to be cautious when it comes to density standards that we don't allow for too many dwellings on a piece of agricultural land, but I think they are necessary.
So when we look at the language in terms of the future of where we're going, are you sufficient with that when you look at kind of the competing? I guess I'm looking to Matt more because you're more on the real estate side and the growth, and some of that argument is coming from that side of the group feeling like the larger tracts, because you're zoned at a smaller rate than what the land is. So you could have 100 acres, you can be zoned 20 acre minimum or 5 acre minimum, which would allow for breaking up. I just wanted to bring that out as a question only because that APA is still being formed step by step, and since we want to update, are we satisfied with the way that it's worded? Because there's not a limitation in the verbiage, it just says that we need to continue to allow it in agricultural areas, which I don't know which way or no, I just know there's still a continued argument about housing on the agricultural
I think that's
side
a
of it.
good question, Commissioner. I do think, though, that, and I realize we haven't finalized it, but when we look at the current proposed land use component and the designations, the proposal right now is 10 acres would be the minimum size for an agricultural designated piece of land. And so based on that, that's the maximum density that we're looking at that would align with this language. And I think we have to have this capability, otherwise the small scale agriculture that we're saying we also want to support doesn't become viable. Because to do that kind of small scale agriculture, you have to live on the land that you're supporting or that's supporting you.
But so I don't not understand that. I'm looking at the growth that you can have. So if your 10 acres is deemed agriculture and you put it in a trust and you build your house and your accessory dwelling, that's what I'm talking about. The
Right.
direction that we're going, just that that's the way we want to say it, is all it's just something that keeps coming up is living on the land, so.
Well, and Matt here, and if you actually look at the use tables, residential uses are allowed, and it spells out, you can have an accessory dwelling or anything like that. That's in the use tables.
This is Dave. Does it help clarify if we said continue allowing residential uses consistent with the allowable density in agricultural zoning districts? Because that's really, we didn't say those words, but that's what we meant.
I like the way you said it better than continue being permitted, because it's the guardrail of, because part of what this section is to protect the agricultural land. And so I hear the argument, I'm just hearing the state conversation about the agricultural land and living on it as a question, and I don't know the answer, and obviously no one really knows the answer because we wouldn't talk about it year after year. But I like the way that you verbalized it just there.
He's going to have to say it again.
Continue allowing residential uses consistent with the allowable density in agricultural zoning districts. So that just says, if you're an AF10, house on 10 acres, AF20, house on 20 acres. And if I'm not mistaken, our current code, if you have 100 acres in AF20, you could put 5 houses on it. It's
Plus an accessory dwelling unit.
it's not very practical from like a financing perspective often and things like that, but without splitting the lot, but it can be done. So a family could have a couple homes on it. I think that was maybe from your sub area.
Yeah.
There was a desire to allow multiple generation housing on a very large tract of farmland.
And so when you go to policy number 3 about the cottage industry on ag land, does that move you away from this particular section? When I think of cottage, I think of like this, what is that? Vacation rental stuff or smaller homes? What does that mean in this particular section? This looks like it was in another section as well, this verbiage.
Well, cottage industries may actually be a little bit redundant here. I mean, the county has a well-defined set of different levels of home occupational uses, and I think our intention was to continue to allow those in ag areas, even though they were ag 10 or ag 20, whatever it might be. And they could be ag-related, but not necessarily. And there are uses, and so there's different levels of home occupation uses depending on the scale of what's being done, and there are different standards that have to be met
So
in accordance.
this one is actually telling us that the land use regulation should support those things. Do we need that in this section then, under agriculture, or is it just in land use already tells us that we're going to support those and we have the tables and all that other stuff? Does that section even need to be under? Because when I read it, it sounds like I need to support cottage industries on agricultural land.
I would want to make sure that we picked it up. I would, first, let me go back a minute. I would include the ag-related topics in this policy. So support or
Farm stands and
enable is
other
probably a better
agribusiness.
word. Enable farm-based family businesses or on agricultural parcels with land use regulations. Examples include farm stands, et cetera. The home hawk and cottage industries, you could make an argument that maybe that should be treated in the land use component or in our land use implementation section.
And then we're gonna, I think.
But I would want to make sure that we went and picked that up, because I'm not sure that we did.
And I think it's important to address the farm stands, that some of these, a question has come up, and I don't know that I agree that it should be there, that the language should say the word enable. I think essentially we're instead of like support, because what does that mean? We're going to change out everywhere where we see that kind of language. And so then that would address that. Do you have any comment on that, Commissioner Domke?
I think enable's a good term. That's been pretty thoroughly vetted through our discussions, and I like that term.
Any issue with removing home occupations and cottage industries from that line and just leaving the farm-based family business and then allowing home occupations and cottage industries, noting it needs to be reviewed to make sure that it's addressed through land use, but that's where that's addressed?
I would suggest, I would suggest leaving home occupations in there because I think we'll have some examples of, farms where somebody in the farm has a knitting business or a small woodworking thing in their garage or whatever. I think we wanted to make sure we were allowing for that. Cottage-based industries or cottage industries, maybe they can take that out, but I would leave home occupations because I think that probably exists across the county.
Doesn't that get resolved in the land use? And the
Well, I don't see
reason
any reason, we'd have to go back and look, but I don't see any harm in leaving it here because we're talking about agriculture and there could be a use that's pretty prevalent, I think.
I think the use tables could define it.
I think the reason I push towards using the table and not the sentence there is specifically we've had some cases where the home occupation was used to identify activities that, there was a case. They were selling wine, their business was wine, or the agriculture was growing grapes or something, and then it became a, what is that, where you taste wine or something?
I'm
like
somewhat
that?
familiar with that case because I looked into it. It became a winery.
Yeah,
And-
and so is that a home occupation? Because that's the thing that jumps out in my mind when I see it as a generic term within the agriculture versus just letting it be in the use table, and then it gets adjudicated through the request for the occupation versus saying it's right already there because it's in that line. That's just what my thought is on it.
Well, so a couple of comments. One, this is Dave Frankenbach. I think there's language in many of the sub-areas. There certainly is in the Sagal sub-area, and I think we put it in maybe elsewhere in the comp plan, that there's a desire to support home occupations in all land use designations, right? So that's not specific to ag. And I kind of agree with Alan. I'm not sure that it hurts to leave it here, but on the other hand, you could take it out if we made sure that we covered it in the land use section, specific to home occ. I think cottage industries, to me, that's just another way of saying home occupations. It's a small industry that you run out of your home. It could be a woodworking shop or whatever. So to
Can I
me,
ask you to clarify? I'm not familiar with that term, and I think, in my mind, I think of actual building as cottage. What is cottage, like, in terms of this plan, when that word is used?
it's an industrial business on a very, very small scale. So I'm trying to think of some specific examples. I knew some people who lived in Bottle Bay, and this is maybe a little more artistic, but they made all kinds of things out of found stones. They made lamps out of stacks of stones, very interesting artistic creations. And they did that in his shop in the backyard.
Is it just a term then? Because how is that different than the word home occupation?
I think it's just another way, it's just another way of saying home
I
occupation.
do think it's redundant, so I
Yeah.
think we can remove it.
It's also like cottage food industry is another term in Idaho that we use. Like, if you want to make pies out of your house and sell them, you don't have to have a commercial kitchen in Idaho, right? Same thing with cupcakes and other things. It's like a cottage food.
As long as you're at a small enough scale, I
It's a
think.
small scale, yes.
Right, you can avoid those regulations.
Who regulates small scale on Facebook?
There was another part of your question that I wanted to address, and, the whole winery thing. You know, I read about that. I had nothing to do, this is long after I was on planning and zoning. So I read in the code, and I was kind of surprised to learn that we actually have a section of code that addresses wineries and distilleries and breweries, which I never knew before. But it requires you, it tries to require you to grow the raw ingredients on your property, to grow the barley or the grapes or whatever you're distilling. But it doesn't do a very good job of it, is Dave's personal opinion. Because it doesn't require that either most of the ingredients that go into the final product be grown on your property, and it doesn't require that most of your property be used to grow those ingredients, which to me would be sensible requirements, the way I looked at it. So if you want to talk about a winery, I can envision where you might need to buy grapes from elsewhere, which is very common in the winery business. But I would want to have a requirement that most of your property is being used to grow grapes that go into your final product, not that you have a grapevine out in the back and you're bringing in 50 tons of grapes from Washington.
Well, and I guess when I look at this section of protecting agricultural use, what my mind is saying, the designation comes with benefits. And a little bit of obligation on the county's part to preserve this. But are we using other things that essentially change it? So if I say I can put 3 buildings on my acreage and then I make each of those a home occupation that has nothing to do with an agricultural type of benefit, that's when I'm trying to balance the verbiage that's in that sentence of, but also it should, some of those things being addressed in land use and consistency of where do we need to update. So if we consistently allow land use to be where we go to see how we're going to update versus within our actual policy, if you add it into the policy, then is that doing, if it's not doing anything different, what's the reason that we would put it in another place that we would need to update? But I also, in my mind, I'm trying to cycle through different things that I've heard throughout our county with respect to agriculture, with some concern of, are we making sure that we're not allowing other things to essentially change it, but because you're 10 acres and you grow 1 row of grapes, that counts as an agricultural pursuit, but yet everything else on the land changes? I don't know, I'm just.
Let me see if this helps. It's actually not in land use. It's in economic development. This is goal number 3, enable development of small-scale cottage industries and home-based occupations while protecting the surrounding areas from adverse impacts. And the first policy is allow small-scale cottage businesses and home occupations in all areas of the county, set reasonable conditions on the uses to minimize adverse impacts to the neighborhood based on factors including, but not limited to, hours of operation and traffic volume created by the business. So I think, going back, maybe we can't take it out here because it seems to be covered in economic development.
I like the definition that you gave on economic
I
development.
agree. It's well defined. Say it once, say it clearly. So I'd say remove it from the section and leave it there.
I also wanted to say that in my mind, there's no requirement that a home occupation in an AF 10 or 20 zone be related to agriculture. And I would guess that a large number of the people who live in your neighborhood, in addition to growing a lot of their own food, may be doing other things to support themselves that you might characterize as a home occupation. They may be making things and selling it, for example. They may be roasting coffee beans and selling coffee, as an example.
Right now, we're on goat soap.
So I don't think, just because it's in an Ag Forest zone, that the home occupation has to be ag-related. It may be, but it doesn't have to be.
Right, yes.
I agree.
Dave, I saw your hand go up and down a couple times.
It was up because I had been going back and looking through the land use component, looking for what y'all were looking for, and it wasn't there. And then I found it in economic development, but Chairman Songstad took care of it, so no need.
Okay. Matt, were you going to say anything?
No, I mean, Matt here, I agree, do we want to limit
No,
those
he means
things?
yes.
Pardon?
Go, keep going.
I don't necessarily know.
He's the reason we ask for neutral, which never exists, but go ahead.
when we asked, for the home farm-based family businesses about, the discussion of, how much percentage should be produced on the property and things like that. We have a couple, I'm not going to call them out because I don't want to get them in trouble. There's a couple places out there that sell, yes, they are farm-based and they're selling farm products. The vast majority is coming in from out of state and they're reselling it. And
That's a complaint that people have because in the county over, does that count as getting an agricultural exemption or is it just a store on a piece of property? And it's a store. So are we enforcing, what does it mean to be agriculture?
That goes back to a prior comment that was just made. I think that needs to be considered going
That's a
forward.
state, all of that is a state regulation, right? The ag exemptions. So that the county really isn't involved in those.
No, I just mean the definition you talked
Yeah,
about earlier
yeah.
when it comes to like a farm-based use.
Right,
Probably need to better define that.
yeah.
But I definitely want to enable it, but
With its
when is it
intended
just a
purpose?
warehouse for commercial use versus an actual farm-based use?
Again, I think you're looking at the zoning and use tables to flesh that out.
I agree.
And the legislatures to fix their rules. Anything further on that section?
I don't have anything. I would like to go back to the top to look at some of the original edits because I have a couple of questions.
Can I ask
On
if
page
Commissioner,
16 of 16, you want to go back to the top?
just one
I
second.
want you
though.
to make page 17 for
Bef-
definitions too.
Before we change, did Commissioner Corn have anything on this section?
We already spoke to it.
I mean, did you, so I'm not sure how he communicated. So when we were talking, he didn't have anything that you would, I don't know if you had.
I brought it up
conversation,
I
just
brought it
notes.
up at the very beginning, so
Okay.
we're covered.
All right, so back to the beginning.
Implementation, page 1.
Okay,
I know we talked about the new policy 4. I don't remember the board agreeing to that. I know I didn't agree to it. I feel that's too restrictive. And when we look actually at the land use, I believe it was land use section, some of the last policies in the land use section, I think were really well written that talked about trying to avoid islands and looking at things in larger areas. And I think that is a better way of addressing the intent than creating something that's so restrictive where we're tying our hands to twice a year to take actions on
Sure,
items.
remember that going in there.
I remember somebody suggesting it as a public comment, but I don't remember the board agreeing to it. So I think we should strike that.
Certainly wasn't something we wanted.
I don't have an issue with taking it out. Before we, well, can you undo your delete so I can ask for public comment before we remove it? Is there any public comment on the request to remove 3.4? Mr. Bowman?
Thank you. Dave Bowman here. Yeah, it was Susan Drumheller, I'm pretty sure, who proposed that. And KBCR had proposed that a long time ago when we were, back when Milton and Dan McDonald put their code amendment in front of ours to make sure we didn't get a chance. This was part of it too, where because there had been such a red carpet rolled out for comp plan amendments and zone changes, and they were really just being rubber stamped. And I realize that's not happening now, but it was happening then. And with different commissioners, it could happen in the future. And so and I know that and thanks to this current planning commission for allowing public input to get language in the land use component that these kinds of changes should be rare and so on. I'm a big fan of limiting them to a couple times a year because they're just, it's kind of like changing the Constitution. It should be a very high bar and not something that's happening regularly there's one of them going to come before you guys right now that they are not typically to the public benefit. And there's just, really no reason to have them happen on a regular basis. So I'm a big fan, and I would ask that it be left in there.
So my opposition to that perspective, and I understand where it's coming from, but one, there could be unintended consequences of creating this level of restriction. And two, the acknowledgement that in general, there's always some exceptions, but in general, the comp plan map is a broad brushstroke, right, high level map. And so things are going to come up where we're going to find discrepancies do exist, and that's just the nature of the process. And so when those come up and somebody can show us that something may not have been applied appropriately on that map, I think they shouldn't be forced to wait 6 months for us to correct something that was done by accident incorrectly. So that's my biggest hesitation to having such a restriction.
Matt Linska here. That and the fact that comprehensive plan amendments, they're not law. You know, they're adopted by resolution. They're not controlling. They don't confer a property right. That happens in zoning.
I see why the request was made, but I also see that it's not necessary, and it's not, I think that the focus of this is the idea of where we want to go. It's not something that is enforceable, so I think it doesn't have a spot there. I think that the idea is built around maybe boards on, commissioners or people in the public just didn't like something. I think that the zoning, I think the rules will address that, so.
I really like the language that's been crafted in the land use section, and I prefer to rely on that language because I think it's much broader and more focused on the intent. And the simple reality to Mr. Bowman's comment, while I understand, some of the history, a future board could have this stricken in a short period of time if they decided they didn't like it. So it doesn't really prevent anything in the future if that's what a future board decides to do. So I'd rather just rely on the current language in the land use component, or land use section of this component.
Yep. Your next one.
Scanning. Can we go to economic development, Jake? Could you scroll back up, please? Let's see. Okay, that's there. And we go down to the bottom of the page, 5, 6, 7. Sorry, I'm having to recheck mine because my track changes. The color is almost identical to the first version that you provided, so I can't differentiate easily where I went and type something differently. Okay, that looks good. And then if we go down to land use.
And we split 5 into 5 and 6.
That's what I understand as well.
That's what my notes said.
Land use. We look at 4, 5, and 6 on land use. Next page. That is it. Sorry, my page numbering is different. Okay, that looks good. And then natural resources, I think page 8. This was that minor comment, policy 5, physical or digital instead of link. No, sorry, at the beginning of the sentence.
Oh. Was it in land use or what was that?
That was under economic development, or natural resources, I'm sorry, page 8.
Right, physical.
Or digital. Just minor clarity.
It's a physical copy.
So a physical copy, there you go.
Yeah. I was
Yeah.
just thinking that too.
A chain, it's a chain. It's a really heavy chain.
I can get a piece of paper to a link to a website. There's no copy or digital link.
Sounds good. And yeah, there's a couple of just extra spaces here and there.
I'll grab those.
Yeah, that's fine. I think that captured it. I just had those few.
This is supposed to be in those areas.
Great, thank you. So, yeah, those are just the small things that I noted, that I had some slight discrepancies in my notes versus what were in the edits. And then, so you see, I paid attention to your email that you sent right before the weekend.
I'm surprised you read it. That's great.
So I'm now going to have a larger monitor at home. It's really hard to do work on this. My suggestion would be that in the time we have remaining, we see if we could crank out some definitions to some key terms.
Matt Linscott here. You know, I was thinking about this just earlier today. I was looking through some precedent. And it's interesting because the Idaho Supreme Court, and I don't know if the district courts do this as well, they almost never quote Merriam-Webster like we reference. We're going to go ahead and use Merriam-Webster. They're using, I think it's Black's Law Dictionary. I don't know if that's something you want to ask Bill. Is that something that we should change? Because I've never seen Merriam-Webster quoted. It's always Black's Law Edition.
About court opinions?
Yeah.
That's because it's Black's Law Dictionary. That's what they use.
Well, I mean, yeah.
And that's a great question for your Title 12 discussion, right? But interestingly, that note in Bonner County Revised Code about if not defined herein, right, reference Merriam-Webster 11th edition, I don't see where that's backwards compatible with the comp plan because it's not a component of Title 12. So we don't have anything, unless we define it within the document itself, we don't actually have anything right now governing how to define terms that we haven't defined within its own document, is my understanding.
So before we go down that road, the way this was noticed says discussion of proposed update to implementation component of the comp plan as drafted by the planning commission and found, and it gives the file. It doesn't have us going into the definitions. And so I would say that that's not in line with what we put as our discussion topic. We titled it as a workshop, but we said what our discussion was. And so I think the definition of terms is a little bit far away from what we noticed this particular reading as.
I'm going to disagree because we've been talking about the definitions of terms within this component of the comp plan. And I think if we want to create a glossary of terms or definitions of terms within this, it's a part of this document.
Well, it says discussion of the proposed update. And so they did not propose a dictionary, an update. We propose that we do that. And so the language of this is we should have this up to be reviewed, and then we're having that discussion. We don't have, that's not their proposal. That was our suggestion and a request. I agree, I support the idea of a definition of terms, but this wasn't noticed as a workshop to identify the definitions of terms. It's to discuss what their proposed update was. So I don't agree that we can go into a discussion about what we want to define, because this isn't a workshop about the definition of the terms. It's just about what they proposed, the discussion of the proposed, of the implementation component.
But if we use that logic, then anything that we've proposed as new language, should that not be allowable because it wasn't what they proposed?
No, they specifically put it on their site that says proposed implementation component. That's what we're discussing, is their proposal. So that's how they notice it, and that's how they identify their document. They don't have, that's what we did. So we discussed the proposal of their implementation section. So as we've come through each section, we've commented that we want a definition of terms, but this discussion is about what they proposed. And they put on, in terms of the planning department identifies this component as a proposed implementation component that the community can see.
So are you suggesting that the definitions would be its own section, or its own component of the comprehensive plan? Essentially its own chapter?
Wasn't suggesting anything. You made the comment that we can use the balance of time to address the definition of the terms. I'm saying this was very specifically noticed in the way we put it out about the discussion of the proposed implementation plan.
Right. So again, that's where I'm saying, I'm questioning if we should define terms that are in this proposed implementation component. So it's just,
So guide me to where their proposed implementation definitions are.
so that's why I'm saying throughout this, we've looked at different areas, and I'd have to find one, where we said, let's add a policy. So they didn't propose that additional policy, the board did. So does that mean we're not allowed to have that conversation to say we should add a policy under a section? From the logic you're using, that's how I would apply it. So I'm confused about why you don't think we can define terms within the document before us.
So if you want to define terms within the implementation, but what you said was, we've said we want to define terms throughout the comprehensive plan. So it's not just this section. We said we wanted to define the terms throughout the comprehensive plan. So your comment was, let's go into doing that. And I'm saying we cannot do that. We were on the discussion of the implementation plan is how we noticed it.
I'm saying define terms that are used within the implementation plan.
So
If this helps, I don't know if it does. It seems to me that you could probably deal with the implementation component as it stands, without, and send the glossary back to the planning commission to develop with some input, maybe say that these are the terms that you guys think need to be defined. Send that back to us, and then we'll work on that and then send it to you as a separate, I don't know, we'll call it a
Appendix?
appendix
So-
or something to the comprehensive plan.
once we're done with the implementation plan and we want to go back and do that, I think that is what we need to do, and that you guys bring forward, like you might have a list of words you want. I don't think that the board made a comprehensive list of terms that we thought should be identified. And I think there's also a community component of some words that the board as a whole, we didn't have that as the board, as individuals. And there's members of the community that have ideas of words. That doesn't mean that you guys would want those words either because of conflict. So we need to address, are we going to do the glossary of terms, and what is the process by which we do that? I think that we have to, for me, I think it should go back, and then it comes back with a recommendation. What is the standard dictionary that we're going to use? I personally don't like the idea of using a book itself that's not automatically updated type of a thing, just for ease of access for individuals. But I think that that's reasonable to do. It's just we don't have a recommendation from you guys of what you guys think. I think we need a workshop on what we want defined. Do you guys have an idea of what you guys think should be defined after we've gone through a couple of different discussions? Because I don't think have you guys met about the idea of the board wanting to see a definition of terms?
We have not. So, it would be helpful, if you're going to send it back to the planning commission, it would be helpful to know your list of terms that you believe need to be defined. And then we can also workshop that at the planning commission level, get a comprehensive list of other terms that people may want, that we might, figure out ourselves. and then deal with it. But it would certainly be helpful, since we've been through this exercise on the implementation component, to know what terms you guys feel need to be defined in a glossary.
So
I don't know if that's helpful, but whatever.
from a semantics perspective, because Lupa tells us that in some situations, we can only look at the policies of the comprehensive plan. I think we have to have a definitions section in this implementation component to have a complete document for reference for decision-making when it comes to what the policies are. Otherwise, I think we're going to have a fragmented document. It's going to become a little.
I think the glossary needs to be comprehensive relative to the whole plan, because we use these terms throughout the whole plan. If you need that to address the issue that you're bringing up, I would suggest you could always handle that by a reference. So any terms in this implementation component are defined in the glossary of the overall comprehensive plan. Because a lot of these terms in the comprehensive, in the implementation section, you're going to find sprinkled throughout the other components anyway. So
The other thing is to address that some words can be used in different areas of the comp plan, but have a different meaning of use. And so when we send you the list, to give a reference of if there's an inconsistency, an inconsistency by way of, does the word service mean the same thing here as it does here? And I think that is a different type of a review than because that's part of what we're trying. We would have to be able to also kind of check through our document to make sure that we're not defining a word that then gets a definition that then is not applied in a different section because we didn't go from top to bottom on that. And I think it's a necessary component, but I also think it's a huge piece of doing that, because words can mean something different, and when we'll know it when somebody wants a use and it's not the way it's intended, and then we're arguing over, but it's defined as this. And so that's why in a lot of things, it's the first thing you do when you're doing debate is you actually define your term and what dictionary you're getting it out of. And I think that I think it's going to be a job to go through our comp plan to do it, but I think it's a necessary, so that we don't have conflicts of definitions. Anyhow. Dave Bowman.
Dave Bowman here. Boy, what a crowd here today. I've been saying this all along. I think a glossary of terms is vital to this. And I would suggest that, and to your point, Commissioner Williams, if you have a term that maybe has a different meaning in a different context within the comp plan, that can be addressed in the glossary of terms, right? It can say when this term is used in this component or in this fashion, it means this. I mean, I don't think you're not going to have a lot of those, but if they come up, that can be addressed in the glossary of terms. And then I would use, this came from my lovely wife, but the APA, right? That should be the first place to look, really, for planning terminology and what words mean. And, unless a term that's being looked at doesn't get covered in an APA, but I mean, they really are the best source to go to. Thanks.
I think that's a good suggestion. We've heard that before, of using the language that is within planning. What are the thoughts about where we derive the definitions from? Because it's easy to go to a Merriam-Webster type of book, but.
Could I jump back in for a second?
Go ahead.
Thank you, because it's something I meant to say but left out. Really, I think if there's going to be a glossary of terms for the Bonner County Comprehensive Plan, and I kind of like what Chair Songstad said, send it back to the Planning Commission and let them define the term as they intended it to be when it got put in there, but certainly use the APA as a guideline to maybe to just augment it or help it. Or if they're struggling to find the right definition, use that as a good reference. But it really should mean, what did the planning commission mean when they use that term?
I agree that I think it should go back to the planning commission so that they can let us know how they believe those terms should be used based on the work that they did. I think that's the most appropriate first step. That said, I'm also reluctant to adopt this component until we have those terms defined, because otherwise we're back where we are struggling right now, which is trying to make decisions on land use files where there are ambiguous terms that we're having trouble defining. And it's not fair to the applicants, and it's not fair to the decision-making bodies to have to try to do that. And if we're starting with a clean slate, so to speak, by adopting a new component, a new implementation component, I would like the board that starts to work with that to be able to be consistent in its application from the moment that we have it forward, and that we're not changing the meaning of terms as we go along through multiple hearings over time, because that's, again, not fair to the applicants to not know how we're going to interpret things and what definitions we're going to land on in a given hearing. So I think we're going to need to get these terms defined, and I think we should be adopting them with the implementation component.
Does the concern not get addressed by adopting the implementation, but referencing where you're going to extrapolate the definitions from? So if you were going to say it's adopted, definition of terms is pulled from the APA, or if you're going to use Merriam-Webster 11th edition, that in and of itself identifies where you're going to get it from, and then your glossary is, in a way, a quick reference of discoverable words that come up for meaning. So
I don't think it will address it right now, because either we have terms that are being defined unique to our document, or we're going to have to swap out some of the terms if we want to use ones that are considered more universal by the APA or some other organization. But without knowing what those definitions are, we're putting ourselves over a barrel with not knowing what the outcome is going to be when we're trying to implement terminology and make a decision.
Aren't you there already? I mean, if you don't adopt this implementation component, then you're going to go back and you're going to be applying an implementation component that isn't consistent with the comprehensive plan components that have already been adopted. The only one that hasn't been adopted is land use. So you've got all the others, and the implementation component that you're dealing with now, which was back in December of 22, isn't consistent. So it seems to me you're a little better off at least using the implementation component that has some relevance to the actual comprehensive plan. Even though it may not be perfect, it may not have all the terms defined that you want, I still think you're better off.
I agree it's an improvement. It's a great question. I'm struggling with it because it's, I guess it's just going to be a matter of, at some point then there's going to be this shift of how the decision-making bodies are choosing to define on their own some terms, and then when they become formally defined, I guess that's an acceptable condition, that we're going to have an alteration of interpretation at some point based on adopting definitions.
Well, you're looking at a time, you just extend the time of uncertainty when you could have some clarity, and with a direction that says where you're going to pull those definitions of terms for. It's not going to be a quick go-through to have commissioners and public and then the planning and zoning give some ideas on definitions. But the update overall is in the direction that it needs to go in. And I do think that identifying where you're going to pull those definitions from Absolutely, actually does help. You're going to have some nuances of words that you feel might mean something different, but that's going to be more of an outside of your bell curve issue, not inside. Essentially identifying where do you want to pull your terms from, and giving that as your implementation disclaimer addresses the possibility of uncertainty of a person who files their request in, and we're at a hearing, because if that's the direction the board goes, then that can be something that's identified at the implementation phase. I think that you potentially kind of just lengthen the problem by not doing something now. But we are at a obviously one-to-one impasse, so.
And I would just say, I appreciate what your further explanation. If we're going to adopt as revised the implementation component of the comp plan at the public hearing tomorrow, I don't see that we're going to be able to point to a document as what we use for definitions, because we will need time to research to see if it's even applicable or if it's going to create all sorts of conflicts. We have a lot of what I think are going to be considered unique, like high density, low density. Those are critical terms. I'm pretty confident that what we're intending is not going to align with APA definitions. So that's going to be extremely problematic if we try to adopt that type of a reference to the definitions without having had time to research it.
Mr. Bowman.
Dave Bowman again. So I completely agree with Chairman Songstad that this, we all know that the implementation component that is currently in effect was cart before horse in a major way. And it was written, well, it's cart before the horse, and it was written it doesn't match what the current comp plan is. And I can see issues with certain things like, how do you define high density? Yes, that will come up. You still have the definitions in the code to fall back on for now, and Merriam-Webster's Collegiate 11th edition for now. And I think not adopting this implementation plan as it stands now I understand Commissioner Domsky's reservations, and they are valid, but the language in what is before you now is so much better and so much more appropriate for what is in the comprehensive plan, that I think delaying it over this issue would be a big mistake. And you can certainly, as has already been said, task the planning commission to come up with definitions for certain, for the terms that might be at issue, like high density or large agriculture or whatever, and get this thing through, because I think you're faced with more issues now where the language that's in there is going to cause unintended consequences as it stands now than you will get from the few, and I think it's a relatively few number of terms that are going to get contested or argued about in the way that it's written now. That's my 2 cents.
So since this is just a discussion time, we have opportunity tomorrow to address that. So any further comments on the discussion of the implementation recommendation?
I don't have any other specific comments. I think we have a good revised document. I appreciate the collaborative discussion process. I really think it's been super beneficial, and hope to be able to do that more in the future.
Would the board like me to post this version, this draft update from the board on the website, just in case? I mean, it is a short notice. The other option would be at the hearing tomorrow, if you think that public needs more time to give input on this, we could continue that for a couple of weeks or something like that. Or you could adopt it tomorrow.
I would like it to be posted, and I actually would like it to be allowed to be digested, because part of what we want to do as a county is, this we want to use to be the springboard by which we keep doing consistent updates, and allowing the community enough time to review and give their buy-in allows us to do that, especially since we know we want to define some terms. That might work. What are your
So-
thoughts, Commissioner Domke?
I agree that we've probably made enough changes that allowing the public a little bit more time for input is beneficial. I don't anticipate that timing and, coming up with a definition of terms is probably going to align, but that's a separate issue. So I think what that means is that we're going to likely continue both items during the hearing tomorrow, because we said we still need to do multiple workshops on the land use component before having something that we want to consider adopting. And if we're going to give the public a little bit more time on this one, then tomorrow will be a pretty short hearing of continuation, it sounds like.
I feel like we've made enough changes that the people need an opportunity to review it, but I equally see the need to adopt it at the same time. So I don't know. Michelle?
Good afternoon, Michelle Johnson. I would like to just say thank you very much. I know that the Planning Commission has worked very long and very hard on this, and giving the community the opportunity to either be involved in person or on Zoom, and to make comments as you guys are working through this. I just want to say thank you, and it's greatly appreciated.
You're welcome. Okay, so, all right, we'll adjourn this. It's